This is Brief Encounters. I am Jill Morrison. I'm a steering committee member of the International Law Community of the DC Bar. And with me is Elisa Massimino, who is the director of the Georgetown University Law Center's Human Rights Institute. How are you, Elisa?
Great to be here, Jill. I'm doing well.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to talk to you, of course, as a member of the Human Rights and Immigration Law Subcommittee. You've had an esteemed career in human rights, and of course, you're now leading Georgetown's Human Rights Institute. So I was just wondering if you could start off by giving me some of your career highlights.
Gosh, well, I found my way to human rights really through pro bono work. I came to DC to work for a big law firm, and I picked the firm based on their leadership in community service. That was the firm that was then known as Hogan and Hartson. And that's really where I discovered my calling. And it was through representing refugees who were essentially my neighbors in Mount Pleasant in the late 80s. And that's when there were a lot of Salvadorans fleeing the Civil War. A lot of them were young, teenage boys who were fleeing forced recruitment from both sides of the Civil War in El Salvador. And the Latin American Youth Center at the time was on the corner of my street where I lived. And the firm allowed me to go there on Fridays and just see what I could do to help. And I used my then quite meager legal skills to help people navigate the complex immigration system, to help them with problems they were having being exploited by their employers and their landlords. And then I started learning about the role of the United States in foreign policy in Central America and the responsibility that we had for so much of what was happening in the region. And that's when really I discovered that I wanted to be doing that kind of work full time instead of representing corporate clients. And luckily, the pro bono work that I had been doing for what was then known as the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights translated ultimately into a job as a staff attorney there when they wanted to open an office in Washington. They were based in New York City. And that's really where things got started for me. Everything else that I did in my career of nearly 30 years with that organization was pretty much on the job learning, on the job training of myself, learning by doing. And I had so many different jobs that the learning curve was always steep. Probably one of the most impactful campaigns that I was involved in was during the George W. Bush administration in the response to the attacks of 9/11 and the policy of the US government to engage in torture of people in its custody. And that was a lengthy campaign in which Georgetown actually played a part. We convened our very first off-the-record meeting with expert interrogators and retired military officers here at Georgetown Law School to talk about the dangers of engaging in torture, not just from a human rights perspective, but also from a national security and intelligence gathering perspective. And because of that engagement that started here at Georgetown, we were able to change the law and actually win a battle in the Republican-controlled Congress to overrule the policies of the Republican president on human rights issues. So I would say that was one of the most impactful, but so much of the work over the years really involved refugees and immigrants and trying to, both on an individual level, working with people trying to navigate the system, and then on a policy level to try to improve the system and make it more reflect the values that we as Americans say that we want to uphold in the treatment of the stranger.
Wow. So it's really interesting to me that you happened upon a career in human rights. And of course, you're dealing with students the same way I am, and you know how purposeful they are in coming to Georgetown specifically to do human rights work. I'm guessing over the past few years, you've seen that immigration and especially anti-immigrant policies have also kind of been a driver for students who want to do human rights work at Georgetown.
Absolutely. So many of my students, I teach a course called Effective Human Rights Advocacy in Polarized Environments. And so many of my students over the last several years have gravitated towards the issues of immigration and immigrant justice and refugee protection in the more and more challenging the framework itself and not just how it operates. Our Georgetown Immigration Law Journal has been sponsoring all semester a really creative program focusing on the intersectionality between immigration and a range of other issues: immigration and human rights, immigration and history, immigration and Black Lives Matter, really looking at the ways that so many of these systems of injustice intersect and compound. So it's been certainly an issue that drives a lot of students towards work in human rights. And it was, as you said, how I found my way in as well.
Wonderful. So there is a public perception in the United States that kind of human rights concepts are limited to international law. Do you find this to still be true, or kind of in your talking about doing human rights work, is there a growing kind of understanding that human rights are something that applies to people living in the United States and that the US system very often are acting against human rights, both on their own citizens and on people abroad?
Absolutely. I think, the perception is still there for sure. In fact, I still have students in my human rights course who come to me and say that they have an idea for a human rights campaign, but they're not sure that it is really about human rights. And then they'll say, it's about the right to clean water or something about fair housing. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell them, this is human rights. The famous quote from Eleanor Roosevelt about where do human rights begin? In small places close to home. If they don't have meaning there, they won't have meaning anywhere. And Dr. King certainly towards the end of his life was, talking about moving from the era of civil rights to human rights. It's somewhat of a quirk of American history, I guess, how the paths or branches of rights discourse have diverged, with human rights being seen as something somehow international and civil rights being what we talk about here at home. But I see those branches coming back together now, as really they were at the beginning, and they were separated in some ways by the rhetoric of the Cold War. But now in the United States, we have, and there was a great leap forward under President Obama's administration of talking about, for example, healthcare as a human right. We have, the Secretary of HUD talking about housing as a human right. And these are new concepts inside the United States, but they were present at the creation, really, of the international human rights framework, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I'm pleased to see that that's, we are coming back together in this rights discourse, and that lawyers are really understanding that, I encourage students actually to start looking for work on human rights close to home. My own experience, I didn't have to go to Geneva. I had to walk just across 17th Street to see how my own government was infringing on the rights of people who lived in my neighborhood. So I think it's a really important direction that we're going on rights discourse in the United States. And I'm pleased to be part of that here at the Human Rights Institute at Georgetown.
Wow. Well, I think part of this might be a reflection of American exceptionalism, in that to say that human rights are the things that happen outside of the United States is to make a presumption that we are the ones that are doing everything right. And of course, we know that to not be true. Interestingly enough, just the other day, I was interviewing a fellow for a program that I run who is from the Gambia, and she described the murder of George Floyd as a human rights violation. And that's just not the way we've been thinking about police brutality and other human rights violations that happen here on American soil.
It's really useful to have someone hold up a mirror from outside the United States so that Americans can understand and see the commonality of human rights abuses. And, in some ways that can be challenging to the self-image of Americans, but it also, the flip side of that is that we are all struggling towards a better day together and that we can learn from each other in how to combat these abuses.
Yeah. So you had mentioned the quote, small places close to home. And I know that you've initiated a series with the Human Rights Institute centered around that theme. Can you tell me kind of what your goals are for that series?
Yes, we are really trying to use this as a way of shifting the discourse, just as we discussed, kind of centering this on the quote by Eleanor Roosevelt to disrupt this concept that the struggle for freedom and dignity and human rights is something that happens somewhere else. And so we are highlighting human rights issues and struggles inside the United States. We started with a discussion with Diane Russ Tierney, our Draining Chair in Human Rights this year, who was in conversation with Mark Bookman, who's the executive director of the Atlantic Center for Capital Representation and the author of this new book, A Descending Spiral, Exposing the Death Penalty in 12 Essays. So had a fascinating conversation about the trajectory of the campaign to abolish the death penalty. And then, of course, you spearheaded our second conversation in that series focused on abortion law and women's reproductive rights in the United States around the Supreme Court case that was being heard in early December of last year. And we're now in the planning stages for our next conversation series that will feature a graduate of Georgetown Law School who has been working for nearly a decade now on the human rights housing.
Wonderful. I was wondering if you could, just changing topics, if you could speak a bit about the persecution of human rights defenders. A lot of our fellows in the Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship Program have worked on this specific issue, especially with the ABA. They actually have a specific program focused on defending international human rights defenders. So I was wondering if you could just speak a bit about both that issue and kind of the convergence that you see with the persecution of also journalists, who very often are the first ones to shine a light on human rights offenses.
Yes, I spent a lot of time working on these issues at Human Rights First, where I spent most of my career. And as the profession developed, and you had human rights defenders, human rights activists in every country, just as you have with journalists who are truth tellers and standing up against government and other repression and human rights violations, they become targets of the perpetrators of human rights violations, targets of authoritarian governments. And, we're in a time now in which it's extremely dangerous for human rights defenders in many countries. Hundreds of human rights defenders are killed every year. Actually, this week, the UN Human Rights Council began its weeks-long meeting, and the current UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, her report, Mary Lawler is her name, she's a longtime human rights activist from Ireland, filed a report at the end of last year that's being considered during this session on the situation of human rights defenders who are particularly focused on fighting corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's obviously very top of mind right now, given what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. I was on the phone this morning with activists in Ukraine who are very much urging that we follow the money, which, as you can see, the United States government and the EU are somewhat related, but now focusing on using financial leverage to undercut support for Russia's aggression. One thing I learned in working for so many years with human rights defenders is that, yes, often they find themselves in need of a lifeline and a way to, get out from a dangerous situation. But mostly what they want from those of us who advocate for human rights from the comfort and safety of the inside of the United States is to amplify their agenda and what they're trying to accomplish. To use our freedom to amplify their calls for respect for human rights and to leverage the power of the US government and other actors in the United States, not just to protect them and their safety, but to advance the agenda that they are championing from where they live.
Thank you. You had mentioned the impact of stemming the flow of money from Russia in the Ukrainian conflict. This brings me to the topic of business and human rights. This is, of course, expansive and it can range from anything from the production of goods that are using child labor to the way that business facilitates trafficking. I was wondering if you could say a bit about kind of the intersections of business and human rights and how this is growing kind of as a specialization within the human rights field.
Yes, absolutely. It's really incredible. And of course, in a lot of places, businesses are, the most powerful actor in some countries, even more than the government. And their operations can obviously have a profound impact on the human rights of people who work for them, consumers, people in the communities where they operate. Some of those impacts can be positive, but often they are tantamount to serious human rights violations. And that's why the United Nations worked for many years and finally in 2011, I think, issued, adopted the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that underscored the responsibility of business to respect human rights, but, you know, most importantly, to prevent or to mitigate, and in some cases to remedy the abuses that they cause by their operations. And that making clear that they had independent responsibility to do that apart from, state responsibilities to respect and protect human rights. So that was really a turning point in the thinking around the role of business and human rights to really move from this idea of being, from philanthropy from business or looking at the impact of business, in the kind of the small scope to really putting a much more expansive set of responsibilities on businesses. And then, that has spawned now a huge field where you have human rights centers, even at business schools, that this is now being taught as something kind of central to the way that business needs to be done going forward. And a lot more focus on holding businesses accountable for the impacts of their operations, including, with global supply chains, this can get really quite complicated, but really putting the onus on businesses to, including through domestic laws, of ensuring that there's no forced labor in their supply chains and that their business operations aren't wrecking the environment. There is really quite a lot that is a hugely expanding field. We had actually this last semester, I think, a careers panel on avenues in private law firms advising companies, in NGOs that are working on business and human rights, consulting firms that are trying to help businesses understand their obligations and how to adjust their operations to account for these responsibilities. So it is a relatively new avenue that's rich with opportunity for legal work and expansion, and most importantly, for impact on improving human rights. So that's very exciting.
Right. Can you give me an example for those who might think that this is just kind of businesses trying to improve their profile, of some of these campaigns that have really kind of turned business practices around, either within one particular industry or in one particular company?
Oh gosh. Well, there are different types of campaigns that have been undertaken. Some are around certifying companies. If you look at, for example, the Fair Labor Association, which is an NGO that at Human Rights First we kind of helped to create in the 90s, when there was this perfect storm of, exposure of sweatshops in the supply chains of certain businesses, the desire by businesses to not have their brand sullied by the human rights violations in their supply chain, and activists that have been pushing for change. That led to this multi-stakeholder initiative, which involved, at the beginning at least, unions, human rights groups, labor groups, and apparel and footwear companies that formed the Fair Labor Association, which now also has members in the universities in the education sector, because universities are involved in the licensing of their logo on a lot of apparel and footwear. And so that has the long and complex effort produced a way for companies to allow for more transparency into their supply chains, to have certification and complaint mechanisms that will produce change in policy and operation, and to starting to think around corners in terms of how to have more progressive policies as we think through all the ramifications that business operations have for human rights. So I would say, establishing these kinds of multi-stakeholder initiatives that can be sustainable so that companies feel like they're not just being attacked, but they are getting some benefit from doing the right thing is, one of the most promising ways forward.
Thank you. I love leaving on a positive note. Thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for all of your work and your contributions, both to the human rights field generally and to Georgetown specifically.
Well, back at you, Jill. Thanks so much for having me.